Hey guys, welcome back to episode 2 of the series, The Last Days of King Solomon's Life. In episode 1 we looked at how God gave Solomon the greatest throne speech of all time, how he gave him the keys to earthly wisdom, wealth, honor, and power, and how he gave him spiritual wisdom to rule Israel wisely. But then we saw how Solomon's heart started to stray away from God. So what happened? How did this great king turn away from God? Let's find out. Now, when we read about the last days of Moses, we see that he died after having sinned against God, when he struck a rock instead of speaking to it. Then David, the man after God's own heart, died after committing terrible sins against Uriah the Hittite. And now we come across Solomon, one of the greatest kings of Israel. But even he had his share of problems. The Bible tells us plainly that when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. That's quite a statement. Why would God say this about Solomon? You know, a lot of people might think, well, perhaps Solomon didn't have enough faith. If he'd had more faith, then he wouldn't have strayed after other gods. Now, that may be true, but the Bible says here that his wives turned his heart, and so there must have been something about his wives that caused this to happen. So why did Solomon have so many wives? Well, you know, one of the things that we learn in history is that most of those ancient rulers had multiple wives. And this was because back then, having many wives was a sign of power and strength. It was also a way of forging political alliances and partnerships through marriage. And so Solomon, being no different, married 700 women of different nations. The Bible tells us that he also had 300 concubines. Can you imagine such a number? This means that there was probably no other king in the world who had as much female attention as Solomon did. He was surrounded by beautiful women from different nations who catered to him and served him. But while these relationships may have seemed advantageous to Solomon, they proved to be a source of great spiritual trouble for him, and his troubles began slowly. Verse 3 tells us that Solomon loved many foreign women and married them, having 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, Solomon probably thought that having these women in his life would only bring him happiness and joy. But he failed to realize that these women would eventually cause him to stray from the living God. You see, they not only brought their beauty into his life, but also their gods. Verse 4 says, "For he had wives also from the daughters of Moab, Ammon, and Edom, from the surrounding nations, whose worship was a detestable thing to the Lord." Now, if you look at a map of the nations surrounding Israel, you will notice that Moab, Ammon, and Edom were some of the countries that bordered Israel. And so Solomon had these women from these countries as his wives. But these women had gods of their own, and Solomon allowed them to build shrines and altars to these gods. Some of you might say, well, perhaps he allowed them to do this because he was tolerant and didn't want to offend anyone. But Solomon actually worshipped these gods along with his wives. 1 Thessalonians 5:22 says, "Test all spirits to see if they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." Now, we don't know which of these gods Solomon worshipped, but we do know that he prayed to Molech, the god of Ammon, and he offered sacrifices to Ashtoreth, the goddess of the south. Now, let's be honest here. We might think that these gods were just nature deities, that they were harmless, and that maybe he just wanted to be polite and respectful towards his wives and their cultures. But the problem with Solomon was that he did unjust allow these women to serve their gods in distant corners of his vast empire. He actively participated in their worship, and this is where his compromise began. Verse 8 says, "Thus he began to serve other gods and worship the Asherim and Molech, gods of the Ammonites. So he did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow the Lord fully with a whole heart, as his father David had done. For he sacrificed to Molech, to Ashtaroth, and to other gods of the nations around Israel." Now, this verse is quite serious. It tells us that Solomon sacrificed to Molech, to Ashtoreth, and to other gods of the nations around Israel. You see, the real problem with Solomon was that he was willing to sacrifice to these gods. Why would he do this? Sacrifice was an exclusive act. If someone sacrificed to another god, it meant that they acknowledged that this god was greater than the one that they were sacrificing to. And this shows us that Solomon believed that Molech and Ashtoreth were powerful gods, and he wanted to appease them and gain their favor. Now, you might say, well, Solomon was very wise. Surely he knew that God was greater than these gods. So why would he need to sacrifice to them? Well, that's exactly right. But you see, Solomon's wisdom was only applicable to human affairs. His wisdom was not able to help him deal with supernatural beings, demons, or the spirit world. His wisdom was not able to tell him how to handle this situation. Or maybe his wisdom was clouded by the presence of all these women around him. Whatever the case, he began to compromise with these gods. And this brings us to a very important theological truth. Demons can appear as angels of light. They can disguise themselves and look holy, and sometimes their worship can seem very similar to God's worship, and so it is dangerous for us to compromise with sin. When we begin to tolerate sin, we open the door for it to take over our lives. So where did it all go wrong for Solomon? Well, verse 9 gives us the answer. "Therefore, from the days of Solomon onward, some of Israel's hearts turned to follow these gods, and they did not depart with whole intent from following the Lord." You see, The problem was that Solomon was unwilling to completely separate himself from these gods. He was unwilling to choose holiness over sin, God over demons. And so when he compromised, some Israelites followed his example. Now, some people might say, well, what's wrong with worshiping other gods? After all, God is God, and no other god can compare to him. And so what harm is there in worshiping other gods? Well, the problem is that when we compromise with sin, we open ourselves up to temptation. And it doesn't matter how strong you are, there will come a time when you fall. For example, suppose you decide to put your hand on a hot stove to test if it's really hot. No matter how careful you are, there will come a time when you make a mistake and you will burn yourself. And that's exactly what happened to Solomon. He began to compromise little by little. He allowed these women to build altars and he prayed to other gods. And before he knew it, he had fallen away from God. And so friends, we must be very careful in our walk with God. Because once we begin to compromise with sin, Satan has legal right to attack us. In episode 3, we will see how God judged Solomon for his sin. It will be an episode filled with amazing revelations. Make sure that you don't miss it. Now, while Solomon was a man of great faith in his younger years, he chose to compromise when he grew old. Do you think that God will have mercy on Solomon, considering that he was a good king in his younger days? Will God forgive him despite his great sin? Well, let's find out in episode 3. And hey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. See you in episode 3.